in the heart of the Roman Empire, where laws governed everything from trade routes to the length of a citizen's tunic. One crime sparked more fear than most: arson. Not theft, not murder, but fire. Uncontrolled, untamed, and catastrophic. Because in a city of stone columns and tightly packed wooden homes, one spark could become an inferno, and the Romans had a punishment tailored perfectly to match it. It was called retributio in domo sua, retribution in one's own home. If a man was found guilty of setting fire to another's property, or worse, his own, for gain or sabotage, the sentence wasn't exile. It wasn't flogging. It was death, by the very flames he once unleashed. But this wasn't just burning at the stake. That was to clean, to quick. The Roman version was theatrical, symbolic, and horrifyingly effective. The condemned would be taken back to the scene of the fire, the same house he tried to destroy, if any part of it remained, was rebuilt just enough to stand again. And inside the charred skeleton, the guilty would be locked, the door nailed shut, dry straw scattered across the floor, oil poured around the beams, and then, with witnesses present, the structure was set ablaze again. This time, the fire had a different victim. Roman historian Sextus Pompeius Festus wrote of such executions in the early imperial era. He describes the crowd gathering outside, watching the flames roar upward as smoke curled into the sky. Inside, the condemned man's screams echoed out through the cracks in the walls, until, at last, silence. Justice, they believed, had been served in kind. This punishment wasn't reserved for the poor or desperate. It struck even high-ranking officials. In 27 BCE, during Augustus's reign, a merchant named Gaius Velius Crispus was found guilty of orchestrating a fire in the Suburra district to collect on an enormous property insurance claim. Eyewitnesses described how he had smuggled pitch inside the walls, timed the blaze to coincide with a festival, and then fled before the first embers caught wind. He was caught within days, and though he begged for exile or a noble execution, Augustus himself insisted that a fire must be quenched by its origin. His home was rebuilt with flammable timber. When the fire was lit the second time, Gaius was already inside, screaming prayers to Jupiter. But no gods answered. The cruelty wasn't just in the flames, it was in the setting. Many of these arsonists were burned inside their own domus, surrounded by remnants of their lives: clay lamps, woven blankets, family busts, and altar statues. As the fire consumed them, it consumed the life they once lived, a destruction both literal and symbolic. And the Romans made sure people remembered. In some cases, after the fire died down, charred bones were left in place for days as a warning. Families were forbidden from retrieving the body for burial. Neighbors whispered about the blackened ashes and the heat-warped door hinges. Children were told, "This is what happens to those who play with fire." One of the most vivid surviving accounts comes from the philosopher Seneca, who described a man named Lucius Atratinus, accused of igniting a blaze during Saturnalia to cover up a theft. He was caught, tried, and sentenced to fire. Seneca wrote, his screams were not of regret, but of surprise, for he did not think justice would wear flames. But perhaps the most tragic case is that of Servia Calpurnia, a widow and laundress in the Transtiberan district. Desperate and indebted, she allegedly lit her home ablaze, hoping the blaze would spread to a rival's property. Instead, the fire was contained quickly, and suspicion fell on her immediately. She confessed under pressure. The court decreed she would face domus ignis, fire within the home. Her modest clay and wood dwelling was restacked with straw and flax. As it burned, locals said the smell of boiled linens and scorched earth lingered for days. Even those who merely attempted arson faced fire. The Romans believed that punishment had to mirror the crime. It wasn't about deterring future criminals. It was about restoring balance, a kind of eye for an eye that left no ambiguity. And it wasn't just homes. Public buildings, temples, and bathhouses were considered sacred. Any arsonist who dared target them often faced a public burning, sometimes inside a replica of the building they tried to destroy. These events became near ceremonial, with city officials presiding, guards ensuring no rescue, and crowds chanting verses of justice. Roman poet Martial once referenced an unnamed criminal who perished in flame beneath beams he himself had lit. The line wasn't just poetic, it was historical reality. As centuries passed and Christianity began to rise in influence, executions by fire remained, but often took on more religious overtones. Yet the secular root of the punishment remained deeply Roman. Crime by fire would end in fire. This wasn't mindless brutality. It was law codified through spectacle. The flames were part of the sentence, as binding as chains or scrolls. And while Roman ingenuity gave the world aqueducts, roads, and republican thought, it also gave us this chilling innovation: poetic execution. Fire was a weapon the Romans respected, feared, and sought to control with both architecture and authority. Their cities were packed tightly with tenements, insulae, made of timber and straw. Fire spread not just from home to home, but from street to street, and the consequences were disastrous. So when someone dared to ignite the chaos deliberately, the system responded with fire that spoke, louder than any sentence. Lex Cornelia de Sicaris et Veneficis, the Roman law concerning arson and poison, placed arson under the same category as murder and conspiracy. It wasn't a petty crime. It was treason against the people, the emperor, and the gods. Even Rome itself had suffered near annihilation from flame. The Great Fire of 64 AD, under Emperor Nero, became infamous. While Nero blamed the early Christians for the destruction, historians like Tacitus hinted at something darker, that the fire may have been orchestrated by the emperor to clear land for his new palace. Ironically, the very man who may have lit the city on fire made burning alive a state-sanctioned punishment for those he accused of doing the same. That included arsonists. According to Tacitus, Christians and suspected incendiaries were covered in animal hides, torn by dogs, or set ablaze as living torches to light Nero's gardens. And although those executions blurred the line between justice and scapegoating, they helped cement fire as the empire's chosen punishment for fire. But it wasn't always as dramatic as Nero's spectacles. In many provincial towns, arson executions were quiet affairs. Local magistrates would pass judgment, and soldiers or city guards would carry out the sentence. The fire would be built under the cover of night to avoid panic, to avoid chaos, but mostly to ensure the only spectacle was pain. Arson wasn't just a threat to infrastructure. It was a social disruptor. It destroyed businesses, religious centers, and homes in a matter of hours. The fear of fire was universal, so when someone used it as a weapon, public trust eroded. The punishment, therefore, had to do more than kill. It had to restore order, and the symbolism of burning a person alive in the very house they lit was both terrifying and effective. There was no exile where someone could live on with their crime behind them. There was no hope of redemption in the public eye. Once the fire was lit, everything about the arsonist, name, body, legacy, was reduced to ash. Some ancient writings suggest that these burnings served a ritualistic purpose as well. Priests of Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, were occasionally present not to offer blessings, but to witness justice done in his name. Sacrificing the guilty by flame turned the act into something divine, a purification by the very element they misused. But the fire didn't always go as planned. One account from the province of Hispania Baetica describes an arsonist named Aurelius Cassianus. His execution was arranged in a replica of the bakery he had torched, but as the fire grew, a sudden rainstorm struck, dousing the flames before they consumed him. The guards, confused and fearful of divine intervention, left the site untouched for hours. It wasn't until the next day that the execution resumed, and by then, the crowd had turned uneasy. Some whispered that Vulcan had spared him. Others believed the gods were punishing the state for its cruelty. Aurelius still died, but not by fire. The change in sentence led to him being stoned to death instead. The ashes they'd hoped to scatter never came. This story circulated widely, giving birth to rumors of fire immunity, and it may have helped slow the use of fire executions in some regions. But in Rome proper, the sentence held strong. Centuries later, Christian scholars like Lactantius and Jerome would condemn the brutality of these punishments. They cited arsonists, who may have been mentally unstable, desperate, or falsely accused, burned alive without trial, silenced by smoke. But the state, for most of its history, never saw nuance in flame. Fire was chaos. Arsonists were chaos. Both had to be erased. Today, few remnants of this practice remain. Excavations in Pompeii and Herculaneum reveal layers of ash and charcoal in certain villas, and while many were caused by natural fires or Vesuvius, some show signs of intentional burning. Fires started before the eruption. Whether punishment was carried out before that final destruction is unknown. Yet the records of execution still whisper beneath the layers of dust. And perhaps most chilling of all, it's believed that some victims were never truly dead when the flames reached them. Unlike swift sword strikes or hanging, the process of fire, especially in confined spaces, was slow, oxygen depleted gradually, skin blistered, hair seared. Screams often lasted minutes, and were described by witnesses as inhuman, like animals in pain. Justice wasn't blind in Rome. It watched, it listened, and it burned. The execution of arsonists was a mirror held up to the very crime they committed. And in that mirror, Rome reminded everyone, the empire may build in stone, but it punishes in flame. Because in the Roman world, if you played with fire, you became the fire. This is Torture's Room, where history doesn't whisper, it screams.